Now, do any of our panelists have any comments they want to make?
I have to respond briefly, at least, to a couple of things that my respected colleague Dick Saltman said here about health care reform, and to disagree, very strongly with some of them. First of all, as far as the process was concerned, there was nothing particularly unusual about the fact that deals were cut, and there was compromise, and that a lot of interest groups were involved in the process. Healthcare is an enormous, part of the American economy, and it would be impossible to get any kind of major reform enacted, without that being the case. The alternative would be something like what the Clinton administration tried, which is, here's our bill, here's our proposal, take it or leave it, and we saw what happened with that. So I think by working with the party leaders in Congress, Obama was actually able to get a bill passed. Secondly, to say that it doesn't address any of the major problems with the American healthcare systems, I think is just wrong. Clearly, it addresses the problem of uninsurance. And this bill would, if implemented, definitely increase the coverage and provide coverage for a large percentage, not everyone, but a large percentage of the people who currently do not have health insurance. And it would do that through the individual mandate. It would do that through providing subsidies to help people buy health insurance if they can't afford it. And there's no doubt that compared with any of the alternatives that have been proposed recently on the other side, such as individual health savings account, it would go much further, and all the analyses I've seen show that it would accomplish much more in that regard. It tries to address some of the cost issues. No one knows how that will play out ultimately, but certainly we know that costs have been increasing rapidly even before this happened. As far as comparing what we're doing to what the Europeans are doing, I think you have to view that from the perspective that we're coming at it from totally different directions. We're the only major industrialized country that does not provide universal health care. Everyone else does in one way or another. None of these other countries have a vast percentage of their population that don't have health care. Don't have access to health care, but we do. And that creates all sorts of problems, not just for the uninsured, for whom it creates huge problems in terms of access, in terms of reducing their life chances, but for the economy, for the healthcare system, which has to deal with these people, for cost shifting. There are just all sorts of problems for our country that we suffer as a result of this. So I think it is a serious attempt to address it. And in terms of the politics of it, the fact is, I think, that it's not at all clear to me that the vote on health care is going to be decisive in determining the fate of very many of these candidates. You're going to have some Democrats who voted for health care reform lose, and you're also going to have quite a few Democrats who voted against health care reform lose. In fact, I would venture that the percentage of Democrats who voted against health care reform will be higher. Not because they voted against health care reform per se, but because they tend to represent more conservative districts. So what will determine their fate will be more the type of district that they represent rather than necessarily their vote on health care reform. Jim Marshall, right here in Georgia, for example, was a blue dog Democrat who voted against health care reform and is trumpeting that fact in his ads. He's probably going to lose, because his district is a very conservative Republican district. So I think that if you look at the Democratic base, it strongly supports this. Strongly supports health care reform. And for Obama not to have tried to pass this, I think would have had disastrous consequences, for his party in this election, because the Democratic base would be even less energized and enthusiastic than it is now. So I'll just stop with that and say, there's a lot more I could say about that, but I think you heard a very one-sided presentation on that issue. Sorry, Dick.
Oh, absolutely. We're having a conversation.
I find Alan's comments fascinating. I certainly can't disagree with him with regard to the electoral implications. But what I think I'm hearing from my good friend, Professor Abramovitz, with whom I went to graduate school, is the classic Democratic Party belief that it is still possible to move forward on an agenda that was established in a prior period of economic, historical, and health system development. It would be nice. I wish I could say, you're right. It's possible, let's do it. My reading, as somebody who spent 30 years working with health systems in a whole variety of contexts, is that that moment's gone. Basically, if you look at Europe, what you can see is that there has been a fundamental change in the approach of dealing with healthcare in a way that really hasn't caught up, apparently, in certain important ways with some substantial segments in the U.S. And by the way, I'm not saying, Alan, that there is a Republican approach. You'd be hard-pressed to find that. I'm certainly not saying there's a Tea Party approach. I'm not arguing that there's some other alternative that we can rapidly turn to. What I'm saying is this one collapses of its own weight because of the economic assumptions, the centralization assumptions, the control assumptions, the damage for small business, the likely collapse of the existing employer base and how that will play out. All these issues, which are part of this. It seems to me that it's important to take on what we've learned in Europe. When you hear the Secretary of State for Health from Norway, Norway is a country that has only 5 million people, less than the state of Georgia, and has $400 billion socked away from oil money in a contingency fund to pay for their welfare state. When you hear the Secretary of State for Health in Norway from a middle-of-the-road government say in a public meeting, we can no longer afford our health system, we have to change the way we deliver care, the state's role cannot stay the same, it is not sustainable, you have to stand up and take notice. In fact, if you look across Europe, and here I will finish, basically, regardless of what we may prefer, the social democratic moment is gone. We're no longer in an era, the era of globalization, the era of changed economies, the era of massive debt. We're not in an era where social democratic reform, in that classic sense of a larger state coming in and providing entitlements, is possible anymore. So that doesn't mean you don't reform. It means you have to find a different way to do it. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party chose not to do that.
I'm just going to repeat again, every one of those countries provides universal health care and will continue to provide universal health care for their citizens, which we have not done. And as Michael Rich pointed out very correctly, the share of GDP that we spend on, government services is far lower. Our tax rate is far lower than any of those countries.
Careful.
I have a question.
Very careful. Look at Ireland.
We're not Ireland, and we're not Greece, by the way, either, and our economy is not about to collapse because of the deficit.
You just made a statement
and
about
look at what
our
T-bill,
tax
look at the
rates are
interest
lower,
rate on
Alan.
Treasury bills right now, which is extremely low. That tells me that the rest of the world is not expecting the American economy to collapse anytime soon, or particularly worried about the level of debt that we've taken on to this point.
As you said, look at the competition.
So the question that I have for some of the panelists, not all of the panelists, is, we see that, and I want to stick a little bit with the healthcare piece, we see that it's really unpopular. Lots of polls, majority of American public. So one of my friends said to me, and I thought it was an interesting point, that the mistake that the Obama administration made from day one was to call it healthcare reform, and that they should have called it health insurance reform, because nobody likes insurance companies. So from those of you who think about politics and polling, what do you think? Would a simple name change have fixed it?
No.
Okay. Next question.
But I want to take issue with the generalization that it's very unpopular.
Okay.
Okay. If you look at the polling data on healthcare reform, first of all, the public is very divided on it, and it divides largely along party lines. So, for example, in the new CBS New York Times poll, when they ask people, do you favor repeal of the healthcare reform bill, 41%, I believe, said yes, repeal it, 45% said no, keep it. When you ask people, do you approve or disapprove, of the healthcare reform bill, usually a plurality or sometimes majority say disapprove. But then when you probe further, you find among those who disapprove, there's a substantial minority who disapprove because it doesn't go far enough, and they wanted something, more, that would provide, greater benefits and a larger role for government. And when you add those together with the people who approve of it, actually that usually adds up to a majority. So what I'm saying is that it's not at all clear that public opinion is dead set against healthcare reform, and many, many polls I've seen from the past have showed that, actually in 2008, a majority of Americans in the National Election Studies survey indicated that they favored a single-payer healthcare system, having the federal government pay for all the costs of healthcare for everyone eligible, like Medicare for all, that kind of thing. And obviously, this reform is not nearly as drastic as that would be. So public opinion is not on one side on this issue.
No, but it sure isn't. Let's put it this way. If you were to ask the administration, did they think the numbers would be like this after health care passed, they would have told you no. They've said it publicly.
The thing that's killing the Democrats this year is the economy. It's not health care reform. And that's very clear.
But that's not what I said, right? What I said was, if you would ask the administration, did they think after they passed health care, the disapproval numbers would be so high? I think they would tell you they didn't expect the disapproval numbers to be as high as they still are. But I'm going to change gears. I'm going to put Hank on the president's staff, and you are now in charge of his communications. And he comes to you with he said, I got this invitation to go on the Jon Stewart show, the Daily Show. Would you have recommended that he do it, since he did it last night? Would you have recommended he do it?
Yeah, I don't see any harm in him going on. I think it's an opportunity to visit with the choir, and the choir is otherwise asleep right now, and this is his chance to wake them up. I don't know that he did. You can't out-funny these guys. You just have to be who you are. And I didn't come away feeling that he inspired anybody. But that's, the question is, what if Sean Hannity invited him on the program? Would he go on? Would you advise him to go on there? And since I asked the question, I'm not going to answer it. The question is, what can he do now? Obviously, very little between now and the election. But there is the question that I think some have asked as to whether he was overexposed too early. It's hard not to be overexposed when you are going to be as activist as he was. But maybe that was the problem, was being too activist on too many fronts, some might say. I felt like he probably was overexposed on some issues that were all of the hot button issues for the people I was talking about before, who were on talk radio, who were never going to give him a chance, and you will never satisfy them. You will never satisfy them. They will always want more, on whatever extreme, whichever side. In this case, it happens to be whether, it's Hannity, Savage, Levine, all of these guys. You will never be able to satisfy them. Beck. So he found a way by exposing himself so much to give them fodder every time they went on the air.
Anybody else want to comment?